Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're talking about industrial capitalism and reforms that came about during the progressive movement. And so you first have to be able to explain what industrial capitalism is, and then we can move on to identify and explain two progressive reforms that addressed this industrial capitalism. And so, what is industrial capitalism? And I bring up this graphic about laissez-faire economy because that's the type of economy that allows this industrial capitalism to happen. So we see the rise of factories, and at the same time we see the rise of monopolies. And this happens because of laissez-faire economics, which means that the government should not be involved in the growth of industry. This means that the government doesn't set any regulations on what companies can and cannot do. While the government thought that this would allow companies to be successful and help the economy, ultimately laissez-faire capitalism or laissez-faire economic system resulted in monopolies. Remember, this is when one industry or one corporation controls the entire industry of a product. So if Apple were the only company selling iPhones, and some of the monopolies during this time were Rockefeller's Standard Oil, Vanderbilt's monopoly on the railroads, and Carnegie's monopoly with steel. However, we see muckrakers, which we talked about in the previous video, publishing things to the public, exposés about the negative aspects of industrial capitalism. And so remember, the muckrakers are what really starts the progressive movement. And so progressive presidents here are Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. We're going to talk in depth about some of the reforms that they pushed through, but they pushed through social, environmental, and economic reforms to kind of combat these bad aspects of industrial capitalism. And so Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901, you can see, and he was president until 1909. And he used a law called the Sherman Antitrust Act that was passed in 1890 that made monopolies illegal to kind of target some of these monopolies and to break them up. And so the first case that he took on was the Northern Securities Company. You can see here in this cartoon, Teddy Roosevelt is grappling and fighting with this railroad man. And the Northern Securities Company was a railroad that controlled movement from Chicago to the Pacific, and they were charging really high rates to ship things on their railroad. And guess who was the owner of this? I don't know if you remember, but old J.P. Morgan. And so he filed suit against this Northern Securities Company, and the Supreme Court forces them to shut down for having a monopoly. Roosevelt also pushes through the Hepburn Act, which allows the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is just a government organization, to regulate prices on the railroads. While he thought that this would be better in making prices fair for the railroads, this actually raised prices of the railroads and helped those big railroad companies in the long run. So it wasn't as successful as he thought that it would be. Lastly, it's important to remember about our Standard Oil Company, Rockefeller's company. And remember, he had a monopoly that began in Ohio and moved into New Jersey. And in 1909, the U.S. Justice Department filed an anti-monopoly suit against them. And by 1911, they were forced to break up. And so these are kind of like the current day remnants of Standard Oil. So Teddy Roosevelt was known as this trust buster that really made it a point in his presidency to kill these monopolies. Woodrow Wilson also, you can see he ran on the idea of busting trusts, which is just breaking up monopolies and regulating banks. And so this is more economic reform. And Wilson was president when the Clayton Antitrust Act was passed. And what this did was it strengthened the power of the previous Sherman Antitrust Act to get rid of monopolies. It also allowed labor unions to protest and to fight back against the owners of the monopolies to get their rights. Lastly is the Federal Trade Commission Act. This is also an attempt to get rid of monopolies. And what it was is it established a group of people, a group of senators, to kind of oversee industrial capitalism and to kind of figure out which companies were breaking this Clayton Antitrust Act and then going after those companies. And so this was a group of senators that their job was to break up these monopolies. And so you can see Federal Trade Commission is the hammer, and these monopolies are getting in the way. So they're supposed to get rid of them. Lastly, Wilson championed this Federal Reserve Act, and this will come into play a lot during our Great Depression unit. But this allowed the U.S. government to regulate the banking industry. And it allowed this to happen by establishing and controlling 12 kind of central banks owned by the United States. And what this does is it allows the U.S. government to control the amount of money that is in circulation, and also to set interest rates for borrowing and loans. And as I said, this is an important way for the government to kind of make sure that the economy is running smoothly, and this will come into play during the Great Depression. So there were also some social type of economic reforms because of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. The U.S. government was forced to respond to really negative and disgusting practices in the meatpacking industry. And so Upton Sinclair went undercover, and then he wrote this novel about how terrible and disgusting it was in the meatpacking industry in Chicago. People were cutting their fingers off, and it was being packed as like pork and beef. People were dying and getting very sick in these factories. And so this resulted in people getting sick from eating the meat. So the problem was no regulation in these companies. The government didn't oversee any of the factories, and that resulted in a lot of really negative products and unsafe products for consumers. And so the solutions were the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. And what this did was it just allowed for the government to regulate and to oversee food and drug manufacturing and sales, as well as meat manufacturing and sales, to make sure that people were getting products that were safe for them. Lastly is industrial capitalism, the buildup of industry and factories was really harming the environment. We see a large depletion of natural resources during this time. And so this leads to a conservation movement in the United States, and especially through the United States government. And so at first, Roosevelt passes something called the Newlands Act. And what this does is it gives federal money to farmers and people living in the West to irrigate their fields and to help protect their crops. This really helped farmers who were upset at the beginning of this movement, those populist farmers that felt like they were being left behind by the government. And then this leads to the U.S. Forest Service in 1905. And the U.S. Forest Service was put into place to protect the over timbering or the depletion of our natural timber resources. And this was primarily enacted in the West as well. And so again, it was to regulate the amount of timber and trees that could be cut down by these industries. And then lastly, the U.S. Forest Service eventually leads to the National Park Service in 1916. And this is when the government decides that specific areas of land are protected and that they cannot be taken advantage of. So these industries couldn't come and take all of the timber or to use the natural resources that were on that land. So answer the prompts.